Okay, in this video, I want to actually have a little bit of a more in-depth look at the category subcategory list itself, explain a little bit more about what the content there means and how you might interact with the list. Again, if we look at our Google Drive home folder, we'll see that the list exists right on the top level, and it's the one here on the left. But first, I want to show you this thing that I've called a top sheet. What I have here is basically a top level explanation of the 82 sort of categories that the system uses. And for somebody who's brand new to this or new to the idea of a category system, this is probably smart to come here and read through this. So it's pretty basic on some levels. It just explains what that category means. Some of them are pretty self-explanatory, but we tried to add an explanation for everything. So what do we mean by an ambience? For example, an ambience is really not usually an isolated recording, but it's something that contains multiple aspects to it, things like that. What do we mean by the archived category? What do we mean by bells and birds and beeps and all of these things? Again, this is purely for informational purposes. It's just for you to sort of get acquainted with our sort of designation of these categories. But it's a pretty useful thing, I think, for somebody who's just starting out with this system. So once you've had a chance to browse the top sheet, let's go ahead and dive into the list itself. You access it just by clicking on it. Again, it will come up in view only. You won't be able to edit this list, which we're doing obviously for safety reasons. What you can do, and I'll show you real quick before we look at it more, is you can go to File and download in various formats. So you can save out an Excel version or an ODS version or a PDF or a web page or a CSV or a TSV. So if you're a developer and you're trying to save the list out to develop into a new tool, this is where you would come to sort of download the list. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so we can see it a little easier. But again, before I do, I'll just point out that you see certain columns: category, subcategory, cat ID, cat short, an explanations field, and the synonyms, which are comma separated. The translations are not currently stored in this master list. We keep them separate. At some point, we'll make them available to just simply download, but because they're not complete yet, we don't want to sort of put them up while they're still missing quite a few pieces of information. So again, at the heart of our system is this definition of this cat ID. This is really the most important sort of piece of our entire system. It's the one part of this that we're sort of saying can't be changed. We don't want people coming in here and renaming these category IDs to other things. To do so would sort of break the entire intent of what we're trying to do. And what we're trying to do is to standardize these categories for anybody who's using them. So again, if we look through the list, you'll see that on the left are the categories, 82 of them, which define sort of the broadest sort of scope for organizing sounds. So all aircraft goes together into an aircraft category. Pretty much common sense. The subcategories, almost all subcategories have a miscellaneous category. The goal is not to just throw anything in the miscellaneous category, but when you find something that we haven't thought of or some type of aircraft that we haven't encountered before and we haven't sort of already assigned a subcategory, the idea is that miscellaneous would be available for you to categorize it that way. The fear, of course, anytime we add a miscellaneous category is that when we're in a hurry, we don't have a lot of time, we just throw all of our recordings into miscellaneous, aircraft miscellaneous. That's good enough. That's not sort of our intention. Our intention is that you basically do your best to assign that recording or that sound effect to one of these categories, which makes the most sense. If you really can't find something that matches, then it goes in miscellaneous. Okay, the next column is the cat ID, the category ID, which is sort of at the heart of this entire system. For every category, subcategory pair, again, we've defined an abbreviated version. The idea with this is that this will go at the head of your file name and will allow lots of different programs to script this information, to organize it in different ways, to fill in metadata fields, etc. It will also allow you to sort all of your like sounds together in a Finder or in the list in Pro Tools or a Reaper, for example. And again, this is really the heart of the entire system, is this definition of this cat ID. In order for this system to sort of work, it's important that the cat ID not be changed, not be modified. It is case sensitive. We don't want people coming in here and sort of deciding that they don't like arrow and they want to use some different word. To do that sort of breaks this entire system. The whole point of this is that everybody who's going to use the system agrees that aircraft jet be called aero jet at the beginning of the file name. And when we look at the file name structure, we'll understand more how this category ID is used. And when we look at some of the tools, we'll see what the possibilities are by us using this cat ID. And the next column is called category short. Again, this isn't really used right now, but this is simply the abbreviated version of the category. Somebody could import this into a program if they wanted to simply view an abbreviated version of just the category. It's, again, a helpful thing to sort of glance and see how we've sort of truncated words or things like that. For example, we're using the term aero because aircraft abbreviated would look too close to air. So we've chosen a different way to sort of describe this in a way that should read pretty easily on a Finder level or on a file level. The next column is the explanations column. It's similar to what's on the top sheet that I showed a minute ago, but this breaks down each subcategory and explains more or less what we intend to go into that category. So if there's any confusion about what a category sort of means, what do we mean when we say ambient celebration, you can put it here. In some cases, it also tells you sort of what shouldn't go in this category, and in some cases, it points you to other categories. So, for example, alarm siren tells you that these are mechanical sirens like old klaxons. Vehicle sirens, such as police, fire, and ambulance, are to go in vehicles siren. It tells you that there's another category that's a better fit for these sounds. So as you get familiar with this system, the explanations column will help. It's also quite useful for people who are translating the list into foreign languages to understand the intent of each category and subcategory. And lastly, over here on the right is the synonyms column. Again, this will grow over time. This is just filled in by a bunch of us who took some time to sort of try and figure out what would be the most common terms associated with that category that we could think of. And in some cases, we did some research to find types of animals or types of machines and things like that, types of old medieval weapons and all that. So again, this will grow over time, this list, and I'll show you a little bit later one of the tools that's actually making use of this in a pretty clever way. Again, I think that over time, this synonym list will grow. We don't know yet all the interesting ways that this could be used. But for example, here again, and I'll show this in one of the tools that we look at later, if you were typing in one of these types of species of animals, this will point you to the right category. So if you type in any of these sort of subsets of primates, the system will basically say to you, there's a category for that. It's called animals primate, and that's probably what you should use. And again, I'll show this off a little bit later when we look at some of the tools. So I just want to kind of scroll down through the list and point out a few sort of areas of the list. The colors simply alternate between categories just to make it a little more readable. The colors don't really mean anything other than that. With one exception, things that are marked in yellow are things that may be interesting to look at because they might not be what you expect, or they might be sort of a solution to a problem that we thought of. So I just want to go through and show you a few of those right now. Again, most of these categories are pretty self-explanatory. They should make common sense. Ambiences, animals, different types. But the first set we come in that's yellow is this section called Archived. And this is our attempt to offer a place to store things like impulse responses, mixes, stems, test tones, things that aren't particularly sound effects per se that you would probably be using in your day-to-day job, but things that you want to have a place to store. So raw is a place to store raw recordings that haven't been mastered. Reference might be reference mixes that you pulled down just for listening to design against or something like that. A scene might be a pre-built sort of long section, an old west town that you've sort of pre-built, or it could be something you're going to use in like a fictitious television show, something like that. Trademarked is where things like logos and things that your client may have given you, and you recognize that these are restricted sounds, you don't want to accidentally use them in a project. We literally have a WTF for sounds that you literally don't know anywhere else that they could go. Something just completely bizarre that you want to keep, but you have no potential way to sort of categorize it. So that's the archived section, and you'll find that basically each of them has a specific cat ID that's a little bit shorter than normal because these are sort of special instance cases. If we keep scrolling down, we have bells, beeps, birds, boats. Bullets is its own category, separate from guns because of the sound itself is sort of different. We decided to sort of split that out. Cartoon is a fairly big section. Ceramics would include things like pottery. Chemicals for acid and certain chemical reactions, clocks, cloth. Communications are basically where things like televisions, telephones, phonographs, things like that, we call in communications. Typewriters, transceiver is a two-way radio. Again, these explanations will sort of explain this to you, but as you work with the list more and more, this will become more familiar to you. Creatures is quite a big list. It required quite a bit of work to try and think through. We've sort of come up with some top-level creature categories. In particular, we've added this creature source category. This is where raw recordings of interesting props that make creature-like sounds might go, or a library that you download of sort of creature toolkit might go somewhere in here. Then we have things like crowds. Designed is basically a big set of sounds that you might be making as a sound designer, things that just don't really fit any other normal categories. So we've divided them into things like bass dives and brams and booms and drones and eerie and ethereal. And again, you can see the explanation of what we're sort of hoping goes into these categories. And again, for everything, there's a miscellaneous category for things that just don't fit. Destruction, crash and debris. Now, for every sort of material in the library, in the list, I should say, things like metal, glass, we have a crash and debris, also sort of subcategory. This destruction category is really meant for composite recording. So a recording where it's not just a metal crash or a glass crash, but it's a composite crash of all these different materials all together. So these tend to be the bigger sounds, things like that. Dirt and sand, for those types of things, again, you can see there's a crash and debris, a dust impact. Doors of all kinds, drawers, electricity, so sparks and hum and arcs, things like that. And we try to explain sort of the difference to us. Equipment is for like gear, so dog collars and police gear, things that typically rattle. Explosions, farts and fights, fire, fireworks. The next big section in yellow is Foley. Foley is a bit of a point of contention for some people because a lot of people don't use the term Foley to describe anything that isn't actually performed on a Foley stage. So in our category system, we're basically saying that Foley is sort of confined for performed Foley, performed on a Foley stage. And we do that sort of as an attempt to sort of give respect to the art of Foley, which is a really important thing in our business. And we have a solution instead for your own recordings, and I'll show you as we sort of move through the list. But again, we see here that Foley in our list is really reserved for performed Foley and things like that. And it says here, for your own recordings, use the footstep and object categories, which we'll look at as we go through the list. Food and drink includes things like cooking, drinking, eating, glassware, tableware, all of these types of things. Cooking ingredients is where you would put sort of raw food recordings. So if you record a bunch of eggshells or something like that that you wanted to use in design, if it didn't find a better home, cooking ingredients, food and drink ingredients would be a good home for that. Footsteps, again, is where you would basically put your own footstep recordings, things that aren't really done as Foley, but sort of wild sort of recording. Games, geothermal, glass, gore, guns here by various types. Horns, again, an explanation of how we decided to break out the horn category. Human, ice. I should point out, let me scroll backwards real quick and just point out one thing, which is that crowds in our list is separate from voices. So in our system, sort of crowds is a group recording. More than a couple of people, basically, is a crowd. And we have sort of quite a few breakdowns of different sort of crowd recordings. And again, we have ice, lasers, leather, liquid and mud is sort of a combined. Now, liquid does not include water, which is its own category, but liquid, we typically define things thicker than water. So oil, drips, and things like that would go in here. Machines, magic, mechanical, metal of all types. Metal's a good example of how we've decided to break down our elements sort of categories or our materials categories. We realized that you could sort of subcategorize something like metal in so many potential ways, like screech, squeak, scrape, slide, all of these things. What we looked for was a solution that would keep the category list from growing unwieldily large. And for most of the sort of materials categories, you'll find that you'll have sort of 6 sort of subcategories. So break, things when they literally break, shatter, snap, cracks, rips. Crashes and debris, again, something in this category would be a crash or debris that's purely metal, so not a mixed recording. Friction would include most of the things that involve squeaking and scraping and stressing and all of these kind of things. In our system, an impact is typically separate from a break in that an impact doesn't usually break the item. So a bonk, a big metal hit, something like that is an impact as opposed to a break, which is where the item is actually breaking into pieces. Movement would include things like dragging and rolling and rattling and shaking, things like that. And tonal, which exists for some of them, not all of the categories, would be like rings and shings and big, long tonal aspects of that. So this is how we've broken down basically materials. And I think it's a good solution to sort of keep it from becoming unwieldy large. Motors are sort of isolated recordings of motors. So a car wouldn't really go here, but a particular recording of a gas generator or something like that, a servo or a turbine would go here. The movement category is meant to store general movement of certain things. So movement activity is that sort of sound when a bunch of people are maybe moving boxes in and out of their garage, something like that. Again, it's a more complex recording than just sort of a single prop, but it's something without voices. So it wouldn't go in the crowd sort of library. It would come here. So movement crowd would be things like milling crowds, crowds walking around on gravel, things like that. Insect movement would be swarms of insects, things like that. Animal movement might include stampedes and things like that. Again, there's a footsteps animal category for individual footsteps, so they wouldn't go here. Movement is, again, more defined as a group. It's sort of the crowd version of a footstep or a movement. Musical, things relating to music and musical instruments, particularly phrases, samples, loops, specific instruments that aren't defined by here, brass or percussion, things like that. Natural disaster is meant for composite sort of designed sequences, so not so much elements, but really the composite recording that would simulate an earthquake or a tornado or a tsunami, something like that. These are sort of big designed sounds for us. And the next section we see here in yellow is the objects category. Again, this is meant to solve a particular problem. Typically, a lot of people would just put fully prop for anything that they've recorded themselves. We want to try to avoid that for the reason we stated earlier. So our solution is this category we're calling objects. And we've defined a set of common ones that we could think of: household objects, luggage, keys. Packaging would include things like cardboard and packing peanuts and things like that. Tape for sticky things. Wheeled objects for things like carts and shopping carts and wheelchairs and dollies and things like that. And, we certainly think that this is the one section of the list that will probably grow over time as we define new objects and things like that. But if you're recording a prop and you don't know where else it would go, it'll probably find a home somewhere here in objects. And for now, if you really can't find another home, it'll probably become an object miscellaneous. Paper, plastic, rain. So rain and wind and beeps are the three places in our list where instead of using the term miscellaneous, we're using the term general for the sort of catch-all sort of category. The reason we're doing that is this. We realize that for most people, rain probably wants to exist as its own category. A lot of people won't bother or won't be able to sort of split every rain recording out into one of these sort of subsets. In the instance of rain and wind and beeps, the subcategories that are offered are sort of the special case instance of that sound, and general is where you probably would put a lot of your recordings. So the cat ID for rain just stays simply rain instead of rain miscellaneous. And again, there are only three places in the list where we do this. And we do this for rain, we do this for wind, and we do this for beeps. And again, the reason is that to us, the general category rain, wind, and beeps is probably where most of those things are going to go. And we didn't want to call it miscellaneous because that sort of implies that that's sort of like the last place you would look for these. So that's the difference with these three categories. I hope that makes sense. Robots, rocks, rope, rubber, sci-fi. Sci-fi is a big category in the sense that a lot of people are using it for different types of shows. We decided to sort of group all the sci-fi type sounds together. Sci-fi doesn't necessarily mean sort of cheesy sounds. I know that in some lists before that's how that's been defined. For us, we actually have defined a sci-fi retro category for particularly old style cheesy sound effects. But you'll see that basically something like alarm, computer, door, which are basically full categories in other parts of the list, become subcategories of sci-fi, because what we thought was that a lot of people are going to want to lump all of these sci-fi sounds together. So sci-fi is a little bit of a special case as well, because it uses subcategories that are actually categories in other places. So when you're looking for sci-fi things, you should come to the sci-fi category. This is where you'll want to find them. Sports are defined as where they're played, more or less. This is a tricky one, but this was our best solution. So sports that are played on a court, in a field, in a gym, other indoor sports, skating sports like roller skating, skateboarding, track and field, water sports, swimming, diving, things like that, and winter sports, skiing, bobsledding, snowboarding, all of these kind of things. Swish and Whoosh are combined into a category we're calling swooshes, and each of them has a subcategory. And what you'll see is that each of them has a separate cat ID, Swish and Whoosh. And this is also, in a sense, kind of a general case like we're talking about with rain and wind. A lot of people just want their swishes and whooshes with a very simple cat ID at the beginning because they're going to have a lot of them. there's a lot of argument about this in the sound community. Is there a difference between a swish and a whoosh? In our system, we're saying there is. A swish is basically smaller than a whoosh. A swish is what the sound of your arm would make in a fight sequence, something like that. And a whoosh is a much larger swish, usually designed, and it's meant for a train car flying over your head, something gigantic like that. That's sort of our definition of swishes and whooshes. Various tools, toys, trains broken down by different types. This set here, user interface, which I should probably color yellow at some point, is another one that probably needs a little explanation. User interface is basically when you're interacting with technology, the sounds that it kind of makes back. So computer, startup tones, the sound of your phone beeping back to you, things like that. We tried to sort of define subcategories that made sense for most of the sort of types of sounds that you would interact with. So an alert is some kind of a chime or notification sound. A glitch when the screen is, doing something wrong. Think of these sounds as sort of things you would see in the sort of CSI sort of television show where the screen is full of information and things like that. So again, data would appear here, things like that. I realize data is out of alphabetical, or I'll have to change that. Motion for if somebody's sliding something on and off the screen, that classic sort of wipe sound. Vegetation, particularly for recordings, isolated recordings of things like trees, leaves, and grass. So I wouldn't put wind here. Wind has its own sort of vegetation subcategory, but things like a tree fall or isolated movement of through leaves, things like that would go here. Again, vehicles is quite a large category defined by lots of different things. One thing to note here is that we've defined a category called vehicles freight. This is our solution for things like semi-trucks, big delivery trucks, box vans, and these kind of things, separate from truck, van, and SUV, which are really for passenger vehicles and things like that. Utility vehicles covers things like golf carts and Cushmans. Wagons covers old wagons, buggies, sort of horse-drawn carriages, things like that. Construction would cover, giant cranes and bulldozers and all that kind of stuff. Farm vehicles would cover tractors and other tools used around a farm. So again, most vehicle you can think of should have a home here, we hope. Motorcycles covers basically scooters, Vespas, all of these kind of things. More or less any two-wheeled motorcycle type vehicle goes here. Voices, again, is our solution to sort of single voices as opposed to crowds. So a single person singing, cheering, crying, grunting. Futzed voice could go here for a PA speaker, an announcement. Historical voices would be old recordings of famous speeches that are sort of now in the public domain. Laughing, a reaction is an ooh and an ah or a boo, things like that. A single person singing would go here. Water, of course, defined as quite a few different sounds that it makes and things like that. We also have something like plumbing, which is things like sinks and showers and toilet flushes. Waterfalls and fountains get their own sort of subcategories in this list as well because they're common enough sounds and items that you're likely to search for. Surf is that general sound of the ocean, sort of from a distance, the sort of roar of it. Wave would be the individual waves crashing on the shore that would be sort of more cuttable. So that's water. Weapons, again, is for any other weapon beside a gun, which has its own category. Most of these would fall under sort of handheld and medieval sort of style weapons mostly, but whips are here as well. Siege weapons, pole arms such as spears and things like that. Knives, blunt weapons like clubs and maces. Bow would include bow and arrow sounds, crossbow sounds. An arrow has its own sound because arrow impacts and things like that, the sliding sound of arrows. We saw earlier that rain was its own category, but thunder goes under weather. So we have basically weather has hail, storms, and thunder. So a storm is more of a composite recording that sort of isn't just rain. It isn't just wind. It might be leaves blowing through the wind and wind chimes in a big sort of composite storm. And wind, again, is broken down. Wind has, again, this general category as opposed to a miscellaneous category because most of your winds are probably going to fall into this category. But we also break down wind into designed winds, so artificial winds, wind machines, things like that. Wind gusts for isolated wind gusts that you want to be able to cut into a scene. Interior wind, so wind howling through windows and doors, particularly a tonal wind like wind through wires and overly whistly winds and things like that. And wind through vegetation, so wind through grass, wind through trees, wind through leaves. Windows gets its own category as opposed to just lumping it into doors. So again, by type. Often doors, windows have a hardware sort of category for the latches and mechanisms and things like that. Wings covers bird wing flaps, creature wing flaps like a giant dragon, or small isolated insect sort of wing flaps. And lastly, wood, which again follows our other sort of breakdown of materials into crashes, friction, impact, movement, tonal. Probably not a lot of wood tonal sounds, but there are some, and so we have a home for them. So This is kind of a glance at the list. I'm not going to go through every single item here. You can read the explanations column and really understand what we're intending them to be used for. But I hope that gives you kind of an overview of what it is that the list represents and sort of sense of how you would sort of use it. Really, the idea is that every sound that you want to categorize would find a home somewhere in this list. You would assign it to a cat ID, and this cat ID would go at the head of your file name. Again, when we look at file names, we'll talk a lot more in depth about this. But this is the sort of core concept of this category list, is that for every category, subcategory, there's an associated cat ID. Our hope is that pretty much any sound you can think of should have a home on this list. If you don't know where it would go, ask over on the Slack channel. There's lots of people who will give you advice. Of course, there are a lot of gray areas in any system like this. There's probably more than one place that could hold a sound. There's not a sort of simple right or wrong answer to every single sound you can think of. Some things will be much more obvious than others. But ask questions, and again, over time, we'll look at revisiting this list. We don't really ever plan to remove categories at this point because that would sort of cause chaos in a lot of people's libraries who have taken the time to sort of organize them to this. But our hope is that over time, if there are things that we blatantly missed, we could add additional categories or certainly additional subcategories. Like, again, the objects category may grow over time, things like that. So this is the list at its core. And in the next video, I think we will start looking at the file name structure.